Alright, let's get straight to it because what I'm about to tell you ain't some polite little press conference statement. It's not a gentle reminder for the world to pay attention. It's a gut punch. And when I say gut punch, I mean the kind that takes the wind right out of you. See, in business, in politics, in life, there's one golden rule. The person you underestimate is the one who will change the game on you when you least expect it. And today, that person is India. For years, America walked around like the world's pharmacist. If you wanted life, saving drugs, they'd say, "We've got it. But you better play by our rules." Oh, they played that card so well using patents, pricing, and trade deals like weapons. But you know what's funny about power? The moment you start thinking you own it forever, someone somewhere is quietly building their own. And in this case, India didn't just build its own. They built something the world couldn't ignore. The backbone of global generic medicine. Let's not sugarcoat this. America's pharmaceutical industry isn't just about business. It's about leverage. You control medicine, you control lives. And they thought that meant they had the final say. But what they didn't see coming was India, quietly becoming the world's largest supplier of affordable life. Saving drugs, not by shouting about it, not by waving flags, but by actually producing 40% of the generic medicines used in America itself. Let that sink in. The so-called global leader in pharma depends on a country it often lectures. Now here's where the story gets spicy. For decades, India played along, sold medicines cheap, made sure poorer countries weren't left behind, and still shipped massive volumes to the U.S. But then, America did what America does best. They got greedy. They slapped tariffs. They pushed unfair trade clauses. They demanded patent extensions to keep prices high. And India just smiled. You know why. Because patience is the most underestimated weapon in global politics. They let America feel like they were winning, until they weren't. And then came the move 50% tax on all American pharma imports. Boom, just like that. A surgical strike without firing a single bullet. A policy change that shook the U.S. healthcare system at its foundation. And before you ask, why would they do that? Let's be real. This wasn't just about money. This was about respect. You can't keep taking from someone, squeezing them for decades, and expect them to keep serving you with a smile. Here's the part America hates to admit. This tax wasn't even the real punishment. The real punishment is the ripple effect. See, American pharma isn't just selling medicine to India. They're using India's market to fund their research, to keep their stock prices high, to justify their global dominance. When that profit margin takes a hit, suddenly CEOs are nervous. Wall Street gets jittery, and politicians start making phone calls they swore they'd never make. And let's talk about what this means for ordinary Americans. Millions of them rely on cheaper generic drugs from India to survive. Blood pressure medicine, cancer treatments, HIV drugs, diabetes medication, you name it. They've been buying these at a fraction of the price because India refused to play the price gouging game. But when India decides enough is enough, overnight that affordability disappears, and you know what happens next. People start asking why the richest country in the world can't produce affordable medicine for its own citizens. That's not just an economic question. That's a moral one. People forget something about India. It's not just a country. It's a civilization that has been through invasions, colonization, economic strangulation, and still came out standing. They have learned the art of waiting, of watching, of striking when the world least expects it. And this 50% tax isn't just an economic move, it's a statement. A statement that says, we're not your factory anymore. We're not your backup plan. We are a power in our own right. See, in business and geopolitics, leverage isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about who controls what the other person can't live without. America can make planes, ships, satellites, and Hollywood movies, but when it comes to life, saving drugs at scale and at cost, they need India, and when the supplier knows you can't walk away, that's when the game flips. Now, I've been in enough boardrooms to know how this plays out. First comes denial. Oh, it's just a temporary measure. Then comes anger. How dare they? Then comes bargaining. Okay, what do you want? Let's talk trade. And finally, acceptance, because when the other side knows their worth, you either respect it or you get left behind. What America doesn't realize yet is that this isn't just about medicine, it's about a shift in global order. For decades, the narrative has been that developing countries depend on the West for survival. But here's the truth, the West depends on them more than they'd ever admit. And this medicine standoff is just the first crack in that illusion. You can almost hear the panic in Washington. Lobbyists are running to Capitol Hill. CEO are in emergency strategy mode, and the media is already spinning it as a humanitarian crisis. But here's the twist. They wouldn't be in this crisis if they hadn't spent decades trying to squeeze every last cent out of the very system India built to help people. And while America scrambles, India plays it cool. No shouting, no threats, just a calm statement. Our people, our economy, our dignity come first. That's the kind of confidence you can't fake. That's the kind of move that tells the world you've arrived. Now, you might think this is just one sector, just pharma, but that's where you'd be wrong. Because once you realize you can stand up to the so-called superpowers in one industry, it sends a message to every other sector. Technology, energy, defense, trade routes. The possibilities are endless, and that's exactly what America fears. Not just the tax itself, but the idea that other countries might start doing the same. You know what makes this even more poetic? India didn't need to drop bombs, sanction anyone, or rally a military coalition. They just adjusted a percentage on a tax sheet, and it hurt more than any missile ever could. That's modern warfare. That's 21st century power, and it's a lesson the world better start learning. In today's game, the strongest weapon is control over what the other side needs most. There's an old saying, when you have the gold, you make the rules. But in the new world, it's not gold, it's supply chains. Whoever controls the supply of essentials, be it medicine, energy, or technology, controls the future. And right now, India just proved it controls America's medical lifeline. Mark my words, this move will be studied in business schools and military academies alike. Not because it's flashy, but because it's strategic. It shows that in a world obsessed with speed and noise, patience and precision still win the day. And to anyone thinking India will back down, you clearly don't know the mindset. Once you've shown the world your strength, you don't put it back in the box. You build on it, you use it, you make sure the respect you've earned doesn't fade. So here's the takeaway. Never assume the person supplying you will always be desperate to sell to you. Never think your size or history makes you untouchable. And most importantly, never forget that respect isn't given, it's taken. And India just took it. This isn't the end of the story. It's the opening chapter of a whole new game, a game where the old rules don't apply, and where the ones you thought were just playing along, were actually playing to win all along. And the world just found out the hard way. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine, backed by innovation. The decision marks the beginning of India's broader trade assertiveness across industries. What the world just witnessed was not an isolated policy choice, not a random economic tweak, but the unveiling of a deeper shift in the Indian mindset, one that fuses military-style strategy with economic warfare, and one that refuses to accept the old order where the West sets the rules and the rest of the world quietly follows. For decades, India's trade approach had been defensive. It was about survival, about finding a way to fit into a global system designed by others. But now, that's changed. This 50% tax on American medicines was not just a financial measure. It was a field test, a live demonstration of a new doctrine, one where trade is used like a missile, deployed precisely where it can inflict maximum pressure, not out of recklessness, but with surgical calculation in the military. An effective doctrine is never about constant aggression. It's about knowing when to hold back, when to let the opponent believe they have the upper hand, and when to strike so decisively that the shock is greater than the damage itself. That's exactly what happened here. For years, India allowed its economic partnerships to run on autopilot. Even when unfair trade clauses or intellectual property pressures came from Washington, the response was measured. But all along, India was mapping vulnerabilities, its own and those of its trading partners. It was identifying choke points, just as a military would study supply lines in a conflict. And when the moment was right, they acted. This is no different from the way a commander would wait for the right opening before ordering an offensive. Except here, the battlefield is the global marketplace, and the ammunition is tariffs, export controls, and supply chain dominance. The reason this move has rattled America so deeply is because it targets not luxury goods, not symbolic exports, but something essential: life-saving medicine. In military strategy, cutting off critical resources to your opponent is one of the fastest ways to weaken their position. In trade, the same principle applies by imposing a steep tax on U.S. Pharma imports. India isn't just pushing back economically, it's sending a clear message to all industries. If you depend on India's cooperation, that dependency can become leverage. This thinking is straight out of the playbook of asymmetric warfare, where you don't try to match your opponent's strength with equal force, but instead you hit where they're least prepared to defend themselves. What makes this particularly powerful is that India is not bluffing. In many cases, smaller economies might threaten tariffs or sanctions as bargaining chips, hoping the other side will make concessions before the measures actually bite. But India's action is different. It's sustainable. The country's pharmaceutical manufacturing base is strong enough to absorb any short-term turbulence from this policy, and its domestic market is large enough to sustain production without American buyers. That's what makes this so much more dangerous to Washington. It's not an empty threat. It's a demonstration of confidence, a proof that India is willing to endure short-term discomfort for long-term strategic advantage. In military terms, that's the equivalent of holding the high ground and refusing to retreat, no matter how loud the artillery gets, and this is only the first sector. That's what should be making boardrooms and ministries across the world nervous. When a country makes a decisive move in one industry, it creates a precedent. It signals to every other sector, technology, energy, agriculture, rare earth minerals, that the same level of assertiveness can be applied there too. And because India has been building self-reliance programs like Atmanirbhar Bharat for years, this shift is not just theoretical. In tech, India has the capacity to limit or redirect supply chains for critical components. In agriculture, it can set export quotas or price controls that affect global food markets. In energy, it can play a pivotal role in deciding where and how green technology resources are deployed. Every one of these sectors is a potential pressure point, and now the world knows India is willing to use them. This new doctrine isn't aggressive for aggression's sake. It's strategic, controlled, and designed to maximize India's negotiation power on the global stage. The old trade diplomacy model, where compromises were made quietly to avoid tension, is being replaced by a more visible, unapologetic style. In military history, Nations that successfully transitioned from defensive to assertive postures often gained disproportionate influence in a short period of time, not because they were the largest or richest, but because they were willing to use what they had in ways others wouldn't dare. That's where India stands now. The message is clear. The days of being a silent participant in a system built elsewhere are over. From now on, India will write some of the rules for competitors and partners alike. This changes the entire calculation. Western companies that once viewed India purely as a production hub must now consider it a policy player with the power to change global pricing and availability. Emerging economies that have long sought a model for pushing back against Western economic dominance will see this as a blueprint. And for the United States, this is a wake-up call that its traditional mix of market access promises and diplomatic persuasion may not be enough to sway India anymore. In fact, the more pressure applied, the more India can pivot to alternative alliances, with BRICS, with regional partners, with nations equally tired of playing by someone else's rules behind the scenes. This shift also represents the culmination of years of preparation. You can't wake up one day and decide to stand toe-to-toe, with the most powerful economy in the world without having your foundations in place. India has spent years strengthening its domestic manufacturing, diversifying its trade partners, investing in technology transfer, and building up reserves. That's the equivalent of a military quietly stockpiling resources, training troops, and fortifying defenses before engaging in a high-stakes maneuver. The 50% tax is simply the public unveiling of that readiness. And just like in warfare, once you reveal your capabilities, the perception of your strength becomes as important as the strength itself. This is also a psychological move, and that may be its most brilliant aspect. Economic battles are not fought on spreadsheets alone. They are fought in the minds of investors, policymakers, and the public. By targeting something as vital as medicines, India has placed itself in the center of American domestic politics. Suddenly, politicians who may have been indifferent to trade negotiations with India are faced with angry constituents asking why their healthcare costs are spiking. That domestic pressure is far more effective than any diplomatic cable. It forces decision makers to consider India's demands in a way they might not have before. In military terms, this is like forcing your opponent to fight on two fronts: foreign policy abroad and political fallout at home. But perhaps the most profound implication is how this changes India's own self-image. A nation's doctrine, whether military or trade-related, is as much about internal belief as it is about external action. This move tells every Indian business, policymaker, and citizen that their country doesn't have to accept disadvantage as the cost of participation in the global system. It creates a culture of economic self-respect, where sectors that might have once caved under foreign pressure now know they have the backing of a government willing to act decisively. And once that mindset takes hold, it becomes a force multiplier across the economy. Companies begin to innovate not just for cost efficiency, but for strategic leverage. Policymakers begin to design regulations with long-term sovereignty in mind. Citizens begin to see global headlines not with surprise, but with expectation that India will be the one making the bold moves in the years ahead. This shift will echo far beyond pharmaceuticals. It will influence how trade deals are structured, how foreign companies invest in India, how India positions itself in disputes at the World Trade Organization, and how other nations, both allies and rivals, approach negotiations. It will force every partner to ask, what does India want in return for what it's giving? And that question alone changes the power dynamic completely. For decades, that question was often asked in the opposite direction. What would India give up for what it received? Now the leverage has flipped, and it's staying that way. This is the start of a new era where India's economic moves carry the same strategic weight as military deployments, where every tariff or trade restriction is part of a larger campaign, and where the lines between commerce and national defense blur. It's not about choosing between soft power and hard power anymore. It's about merging them into a single, decisive force. And once a country masters that fusion, the old hierarchies of global power start to crumble, replaced by a new order where influence comes not from who has the most weapons, but from who can make the world pause with a single policy stroke.